At 67, Delia Hargrove signed away 38 years of marriage and walked out with a swamp. Her husband kept the house on the water, the marina they built, and every dollar in the accounts. What he handed her was a patch of marsh her late mother had refused to sell for decades, the one piece of ground nobody in town would touch. Her daughter called it fair. Her ex called it generous. Everyone agreed she had been left with a tax bill and a mosquito farm. None of them knew that an oil lease sat under that marsh, hidden in courthouse records only one person alive still knew how to read. That person was the wife Brett Hargrove had just thrown away. 40 years earlier, before she ever took his name, Delia had been trained to find exactly this. She had buried that training to be his wife. With nothing left to lose, she went looking for the drawer she had closed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The law office sat off Charity Street in Abbeville, a converted house with window units and a coffee maker that had scorched the pot. Delia sat on one side of a long table, a folder in front of her, turning a cheap pen over in her fingers. Brett sat across from her in a pressed shirt, answering texts, wearing the easy look of a man who had already won. The mediator read the terms aloud. They were simple, the way a thing is simple when one person spends 2 years preparing for it, and the other finds out in March. Brett would keep the house on Vermilion Bay with the dock and the boat lift. He would keep Hargrove Marine, the marina and dry storage yard with its 60 slips and its long waiting list. The trucks and the savings stayed with him too, along with the retirement accounts he had moved into his own name a year and a half back on account of the business. Delia would keep her mother's land. Odette had left her the Naquin tract 2 years before she passed. 1,100 acres of marsh and open water southwest of town, down past the rice fields where the road gave out to shell and then to mud. Salt grass and roseau cane ran to the horizon, broken only by a handful of stunted live oaks on the high spots and an old camp on pilings that had not held a dry floor since the last big storm. The parish assessed it at almost nothing. Brett's lawyer called it a courtesy, letting her keep it, since it was hers by inheritance and not worth the cost of fighting over. There was a check, too. $40,000. Brett's idea of a clean break against 38 years. "You're being generous," the mediator said, "the way they do." Brett looked up from his phone. "I want her taken care of." Then, to Delia, in the tone he used with vendors who had let him down, "You always loved that marsh more than the house anyway." She said nothing. There was nothing he would hear. He had met Brooke Tatum at a coastal property expo in Lafayette, a broker 29 years younger with a good handshake and a better sense of timing. For most of a year, Delia had felt the marriage thinning without letting herself name it. The late dinners, the new gym membership, the phone that stayed face down on the counter. By the time she understood, Brett had already seen a lawyer and moved the money and arranged everything so that when it ended, she would land exactly where she sat now. Their daughter took his side before the papers were drawn. Whitney worked in commercial leasing up in Baton Rouge, where her father's name opened doors her mother's never would. "He's giving you $40,000 and the land Grandma left you," she had said on the phone, already late for something. "Legally, he owes you none of it. Don't make this ugly." Delia turned that word over for weeks. Ugly. She had given Brett 2 children and a home he came back to between deals. She had kept the marina's books through the lean early seasons, when they could not afford to pay anyone else, and when the business got fat, he hired a controller and told her to go enjoy herself. She had been enjoying herself right up until the day she became inconvenient. Their son said less. Reed lived in Houston with 2 kids and a mortgage and a careful habit of staying out of things. When she told him about the settlement, he went quiet, then said he was sorry it was hard and hoped both his parents could be civil. He did not call again for a long while. That silence cut deeper than Whitney's coldness. Reed had been the tender one as a boy, the one who cried at the end of movies, and now he was only absent. Delia signed where the little plastic tabs told her to. Her signature came out the same as it had on her marriage license, the same loops and lines she had used to begin the thing she was now ending. Out in the lot, Brooke waited in the passenger seat of Brett's truck, sunglasses pushed up in her hair, scrolling. She did not look over. Brett shook the mediator's hand, climbed in, and backed out without a glance at Delia, who stood on the curb with a manila folder pressed to her chest. Inside, it was a recorded deed to 1,100 acres of marsh, a check for $40,000 and the rest of her life. She drove back to the rented half of a shotgun house on the north side of town, set the folder on the kitchen table, and sat with it in the dim afternoon. Her teacher's retirement, from 3 years of work before the children were born, came to a little over $600 a month. The check might stretch a year if she was careful. After that, there was only the marsh, the one asset no one wanted, the punchline of the whole settlement. Everyone had told her the same thing in different words. Be grateful. Be realistic. Take the swamp and the check and move on. She looked at the deed a long time. She had spent most of her life doing what she was told. Now, at 67, in a rented kitchen with her mother's worthless marsh in a folder, what rose in her was an old feeling from the courthouse basement, the held breath before she pulled a record book down off the shelf and opened it to a page no one had checked in years. She did not know what lay under the marsh. She knew how to find out. The Naquin land had been in the family longer than anyone kept records for. Delia's great-grandparents trapped and fished it and ran a few cattle on the ridges. Odette grew up in the camp on pilings, and she raised Delia on the edge of that same marsh, with a pirogue in the yard and mud always on the back step. Delia knew the marsh before she could read a map of it, where the ground held firm and where it would take your boot to the knee. She did well in school, best in the subjects nobody expected a marsh girl to care about. A teacher steered her toward the university in Lafayette, and in 1976 she enrolled in petroleum land management, one of the few women in the program. The oil field was booming. South Louisiana ran on it. Men with leases and seismic maps were knocking on farmhouse doors all over the southern parishes, and somebody had to sort out who owned what and whose great-uncle still clouded a tract. That somebody, often enough, was Delia. She spent her early 20s in courthouse record rooms across Acadiana, working conveyance books, mortgage books, succession files, and the brittle pages where ownership ran back a century. She had a gift for it. She could hold a tangled title in her head and feel the gap in it. The heir who had never signed, the reservation of minerals buried in a 1931 deed that everyone after had read past. Landmen twice her age brought her their messes, and she untangled them. She liked the work. It asked her to be exactly as sharp as she was. Then she met Brett at a crawfish boil in the spring of 1980. He was building his first marina on the bay, full of plans, and he made her feel chosen in a way the record room never had. When he asked her to marry him 6 months later, the people who loved her said it was too fast. She married him anyway. For a while she kept working. Then the bust came in 1986, and the oil field fell out from under the whole state. Land work dried up. Brett took her hand across their little kitchen table and said there was no future in chasing dead leases, that he needed her with him now. She let her certification lapse. She packed her record room notes into a box, put the box up in the attic, and did not open it again. Whitney came the next year. Reed 3 years after that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The years stacked up. She kept the marina's books through the seasons when they could not make payroll, learned which vendors to pay late and which to pay first, drove the children to practice and to confession. When Hargrove Marine finally turned the corner, Brett hired a controller and a yard manager and told Delia she had earned a rest. She decorated the new house on the bay and hosted the dinners that brought in the slip leases. Brett liked having her on his arm at the marina parties. She was good at that too, in the way you can be good at a thing you never chose. Her name was on none of the paperwork that mattered. Through all of it, Odette held the marsh. Brett had wanted it early. The summer before Whitney was born, he spread a plaid across Odette's kitchen table and walked her through a fishing camp development. Lots sold along the cut he would dredge, a little money for her, and a good deal more for him. Odette listened with her hands folded. Then she told him the land was not for selling and refilled his coffee. He raised it again over the years, lighter each time, until he quit asking and started calling it the swamp. Delia never knew exactly why her mother held on so hard. Odette was not a sentimental woman. When Delia asked her once, Odette said only that the land had given the family everything it ever had, and that ground like that keeps its accounts longer than people do. Delia took it for an old woman's love of the place she was born. Odette died on a Tuesday in October, 2 years back, in the hospital in Lafayette with Delia holding her hand and Brett checking his watch out in the hall. She left the 1,100 acres to Delia alone. But what was plain about it? The marsh goes to my daughter, and to no one through her without her own free choice. At the time, Delia read that last line as grief talking, a mother making sure her girl could not be talked out of the only thing she had left to give. She filed the will and the deed in the document box that had held Odette's insurance papers and her father's discharge from the Navy, set the box on the closet shelf, and did not think hard about the marsh again. Not until the afternoon she carried that same kind of box home from the lawyer's office, set it on the kitchen table, and let herself wonder what her mother had spent all those years protecting. The Shell Road gave out 3 miles south of the rice fields, same as it always had. Delia left the sedan where the gravel turned soft and walked the last stretch in her mother's white boots, the rubber gone chalky with age. Heat sat on the marsh like a hand. Salt grass and roseau cane ran flat to the tree line, and the air carried the low, brackish smell she had known since before she had words for it, mud and salt and the sweet rot of things the tide left behind. A great blue heron lifted off a mudflat and beat away low over the cane. Somewhere a clapper rail ticked twice and went quiet. The water in the cuts lay still and brown, holding the whole white sky. Odette's camp stood on its pilings where the ground rose a foot or two, shaded by 3 live oaks heavy with moss. The steps had pulled loose at one end. Delia went up careful, a hand on the rail that flexed under her grip, and shouldered the door against its swollen frame. Inside the heat was worse, close and thick, and dust hung in the bars of light coming through the shutters. A feed store calendar, still hung on the wall, turned to a month 11 years gone. She had wanted to do this here, on the land the paper spoke of. It seemed right. She set the document box on the plank table and lifted the lid. The top layer she knew by heart. The will in its blue cover. The recorded deed she had pulled for the settlement. Her father's Navy discharge, soft as cloth along the folds. She moved them aside. Beneath the insurance papers lay an envelope she did not remember, the manila gone the color of weak tea, her mother's handwriting across the front. For Delia. Run it down proper. For things were inside, and Delia's mouth went dry as she set them out across the table one at a time. The first was a mineral deed from 1953. Odette's father, Aristyle Naquin, had sold the minerals under the whole tract to a man out of Houston for $800 in a hard year. The surface stayed Naquin. The minerals walked out the door. The second was an oil and gas lease dated 1971, granted by the Houston man's heirs to an operator called Gulf Reef Petroleum. The third was a clutch of check stubs under a rusted paperclip. Royalty payments, none of them large, running from the summer of 1972 to the spring of 1979. After that, the stubs simply stopped. The fourth was a map drawn by hand on the back of a seed corn envelope. A few looping lines for the cuts and the bayou. An X far out in the eastern marsh. Beside the X, in Odette's careful print, 2 words. The iron. Delia sat down slow on the bench. She knew that wellhead. She had seen it as a girl, a rusted length of pipe and a valve standing up out of the salt grass where a well had once been capped, the thing the trappers called the iron, and pulled past without a second look. A plugged well. A dud, going by how fast the royalties had withered. Her hands moved before the rest of her caught up, squaring the papers by date, and the part of her that had once read titles for a living woke all at once. Minerals severed in 1953. A well drilled and paying by 1972. The royalties died in the spring of 1979, and the paper showed nothing at all after that. In Louisiana, the minerals did not stay gone forever. A mineral servitude lived only as long as somebody used it. 10 years without use, and it lapsed on its own, and the minerals fell back to the land, to whoever held the surface. If nobody had drilled or produced on the Naquin tract after 1979, that servitude would have run out by the end of the 1980s, and the minerals would have come home to Odette with nobody the wiser. Which would make them Delia's now. Surface and minerals both. Clean. She read her mother's letter last. It ran only a few lines. Odette wrote that the oil men had quit the place too soon, that she had always believed the land was holding something back, and that she had never trusted her own eye with the records the way she trusted Delia's. Run it down proper, the way you were taught, she had written. Ground like this keeps its accounts longer than people do. Delia folded the page and held it in the hot, dim room. She could be wrong, for papers in a box proved nothing by themselves. One renewed lease, a single saltwater disposal well, any small use in the right year, and that servitude could have stayed alive and the minerals beyond her reach. The only way to know sat 40 minutes north, in the record rooms of the parish courthouse, in the same books she had read for a living before she ever became Brett Hargrove's wife. Anyone she told would call it a fool's errand. An old woman chasing oil money under a swamp. She put the 4 papers back in their envelope and slid it into her purse instead of the box. Then she locked the camp and walked to the car through the long gold light coming sideways off the cane, already laying out her first morning back in the records. The Vermilion Parish Courthouse opened at 8, and Delia was waiting at the door of the conveyance office when the deputy clerk unlocked it. The room smelled the way she remembered, old paper and machine toner, and the particular dust that comes off book spines nobody disturbs. The big bound indices stood in their racks along the back wall. She signed the visitor log, set her reading glasses on her nose, and pulled down the grantor index for the years that mattered. It came back to her faster than she expected. 40 years gone, and her fingers still knew how to run a column, how to read past the obvious entry to the one filed 3 pages later that changed everything. The deputy clerk, a woman named Shoreline, watched her work the books for an hour, then drifted over. You doing a title yourself? Shoreline asked, half amused. Most people who came in for mineral work were young landmen with laptops or paralegals from the Lafayette firms. I used to do this for a living, Delia said. A long time ago. It shows. Shoreline brought her the older books from the back without being asked after that, and a cup of bad coffee around 10, and let her stay past lunch. The work was slow, and it was certain, and Delia loved it more than she had let herself remember. She built the chain a link at a time, copying the book and page of every transfer onto a yellow pad in her own shorthand. The 1953 mineral deed was there, recorded just as the paper in her purse said. Aristyle Naquin selling the minerals to the Houston man for $800. The 1971 lease to Gulf Reef Petroleum was there. She found a unit declaration that had put the old well into production in 1972 and the release Gulf Reef filed when they plugged it and walked away in the spring of 1979. Then she did the thing that mattered. She searched every book forward from 1979, year by year, for any sign that someone had used those minerals before 10 years ran out. Nothing. No new lease. No drilling permit. No production. The servitude had gone the full 10 years untouched, and under Louisiana law, it had died on its own and dropped the minerals back to the surface, to Odette, sometime in 1989. From that day, the Naquins had owned what lay beneath the marsh again, and not one person had noticed. Delia sat back and let that settle. Her mother had been right. The land had been holding something back. She kept reading anyway, because a title you stop early is a title you get wrong, and that was when she found the part her mother could not have known. In 2008, an operator called Cypress Bayou Oil and Gas had drilled a deep well on the section that bordered the Naquin Tract to the east. To do it, they formed a production unit, and the unit they drew reached across the line and took in a wedge of the Naquin Marsh. The eastern wedge. The ground around the iron. That well had produced for years. It was still producing. Delia's pulse picked up the way it used over a good book. A producing unit meant royalties, and a slice of those royalties belonged to whoever owned the minerals under that wedge. She pulled the unit plat, copied the survey calls, and drove home with the whole thing humming in her head. It took her 2 more days at her kitchen table, and 1 careful call to the state treasurer's unclaimed property office to find the money. Cypress Bayou's landmen had run the same record she had. but they had run them in a hurry. They saw the 1953 severance and assumed the Houston heirs still owned the minerals, the way the deed said on its face. They never checked whether the servitude had prescribed. Unable to get clean signatures from a Houston family that had scattered and half-forgotten the asset, the company had done what operators do with money they cannot safely pay out. They put the Naquin share into suspense. Year after year it sat there. Eventually, by law, they turned it over to the state as unclaimed property, tagged to a mineral interest nobody had claimed. The clerk on the phone read her the figure twice. $14,260, held in the name of the mineral interest under the Naquin Tract. Delia wrote the number on her pad and looked at it for a long while. It was not a fortune. Against $40,000 in a swamp, it barely registered. What was proof. Proof the formation under the eastern marsh produced oil and gas right now, in paying quantities, into a well she could drive out and look at. Proof her read of the title was sound, the same read that had once made grown men bring her their problems. The $14,000 would cover a real attorney and the filings to put her ownership beyond argument, and it would do it with the field's own money. She made coffee she did not drink and stood at the counter as the afternoon went gray. Brett had kept the house and the marina and the accounts. He had handed her the marsh because the assessor valued it at nothing and his lawyer called it courtesy. And he had walked out of that office certain he had given his discarded wife the one thing in the settlement that could never cost him anything. He had given her the mineral estate. He had given her the oil. He simply had not known it was there, because the only person who could find it was the wife he had spent 38 years teaching himself not to see. She picked up the phone and started looking for a lawyer who knew oil and gas. Yvette Marshland ran a small firm on Calais-Saloom Road in Lafayette, oil and gas title and little else. She did not take Delia seriously on the phone. Older women called sometimes about checks their husbands used to get, and most of it came to nothing. She agreed to a meeting mostly to be kind. Then Delia laid the yellow pads on her desk. Yvette read for 10 minutes without a word, her pen tapping once and going still. She pulled the parish records up on her own screen and checked 3 of Delia's citations against the books. They matched to the page. "You did this yourself," she said. "Not quite a question." "I knew how once," Delia said. 40 years ago. Most title men I pay would have stopped at the 1953 severance and billed me for it. You didn't." Yvette set the pen down and walked her through where the law stood, and the law stood with Delia. The servitude created in 1953 had gone more than 10 years without use after Gulf Reef plugged the well in 1979. Under the mineral code it had prescribed, and the minerals had fallen back to the surface owner, to Odette, around 1989. Odette had willed everything in the marsh to Delia, with language saying the minerals could pass no further without Delia's own choice. "There's one knot," Yvette said. "The Houston heirs." On paper, the old severance still shows in their name, since nobody ever recorded that it lapsed. If they wake up and fight it, we could end up in a concursus, every claim in front of one judge. Will we win? On these facts, yes. Prescription doesn't care who noticed. But it could take a year, and it could get loud. Delia thought about the 14,000 sitting in suspense. "Then we file first," she said. "Put my name on record before anyone has to be told. Word travels in a small parish." Delia had been pulling Gulf Reef releases in the Abbeville conveyance office for 2 weeks, and Shoreline mentioned it to her brother-in-law, who mentioned it at the co-op. A few days later, a clean truck pulled up to the shotgun house while Delia watered her ferns. The man was past 70, broad and slow, with a habit of reading a porch before he climbed it. Hollis Granger. He had worked leases and titles across Vermilion and Iberia for most of 40 years, retired now, his wife 2 years gone, and his days emptier than he liked to admit. "Heard somebody's been running the old Naquin section by hand," he said. "Figured it was a tall tale. Had a see." Delia brought out the pads. Hollis put on his glasses and read the way Yvette had, his finger moving down her shorthand. When he looked up, something had changed in his face. "You ran it forward, too. Cypress Bayou's people never did." He shook his head. "I knew the landman who unitized that section in '08. Fast kid, lazy on the back end. took the 1953 deed at face value and dumped your grandmother's royalties into suspense rather than chase the title. He tapped the X on the seed corn map. That iron out there's a dead shallow well. Worthless. That's not what anybody wants now. Then what do they want? That's a geologist's answer, Hollis said. I know the one to ask. Dr. Lena Osei taught at LSU and consulted on the side as she drove down the next week because Hollis asked and the puzzle interested her. She spread Cypress Bayou's production data on the cam table while a fish rolled in the cut outside. Your old well was shallow, she said. 2,800 feet, a thin sand tapped out fast. That's why Gulf Reef quit. She laid down a cross-section gone red and orange along the bottom. What nobody could reach in 1979 sits far below it. Cypress Bayou's 2008 well went past 13,000 feet into a deep sand the old rigs and the old budgets never touched. It still makes oil. And the way this geology runs, that same sand almost certainly carries west under your eastern marsh under the iron. Delia looked at the colored layers, at a depth her mother could never have pictured. The land had been holding something back. It had only been holding it deeper than anyone cared to dig. The lease offer came faster than she expected. Hollis made 2 calls, and the second reached Curtis Lemoyne, land manager for Bayou Verde Energy out of Lafayette, who had been hunting acreage near the Cypress Bayou unit for a year. Curtis came out himself and walked the high ground in good boots that did not stay good. Then he made his offer at the same plank table where Brett had once spread his fishing lot plat in front of Odette. A lease on the Naquin minerals, a bonus per acre on the productive eastern tract, and a royalty on whatever the deep sand gave up. The bonus and royalty came to real money, the first anyone had ever put on the table for the marsh, and it rose out of the same ground 3 different men had told 3 generations of Naquin women was worth nothing. Delia told Curtis her attorney would read every line before she signed. Then she walked him out, the way Odette used to walk Brett out, and stood on the loose steps watching his truck pick its way back up the shell road toward town. Brooke kept a broker friend in Lafayette who tracked lease filings for a living, and a friend mentioned over lunch that Bayou Verde had been taking acreage down near the old Cypress Bayou unit, marsh included, ground that had sat dead for years. By Saturday, Brett knew. By Monday, he was on the shell road in pressed khakis and clean deck shoes, easing his truck around the soft spots toward the camp he had once tried to buy out from under Odette. Delia heard the engine before she saw it. She was on the steps with a thermos and her yellow pads, marking the survey calls Yvette had asked for. She did not get up. Brett climbed out, looked the camp over the way he looked over a boat he meant to lowball, and put on a smile that stopped at his cheeks. You're a hard woman to find these days. What do you want, Brett? Heard you've been spending time out here. He glanced at the pads, at the boots, at her. Heard you had oil people coming around. I got worried. You weren't worried for 2 years. He let that pass and tried another road. Look, I've been thinking about you. This is a lot to carry at our age. The marsh, the lawyers, those land companies. They'll smile at you and pick you clean, and you won't see it coming. He spread his hands, reasonable, generous. Let me take it off your plate. I'll buy it back. Keep it simple between us. 60,000 cash, friendly. That's a good turn on a swamp nobody else would touch. Delia almost laughed, and the sound that came out was close to it. There's a producing unit on the eastern tract, Brett. There has been since 2008. I've got a lease offer on this table with a bonus and a royalty, and the bonus alone is more than your 60. This land isn't for sale, and if it were, you couldn't afford the part you gave away. His face changed then, the warmth gone like a switch thrown. Be reasonable. You're not getting younger. You'd rather have the cash and no headaches than fight oil lawyers for years. No, those minerals came out of our marriage. His voice had an edge now, the one he used on a vendor who had crossed him. Everything we had, we built together. You know that. The land was my mother's. She left it to me, and to no one through me. You sat in that office and signed it over because your lawyer called it a courtesy. She stood up at last, level with him on the loose step. You gave me the swamp, Brett. I'll keep the swamp. He drove off too fast for the road, fishtailing once in the shell, and Delia watched the dust hang and settle over the cane. She thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong about that, the way she had once been wrong about a great many things. The letter came 2 weeks later, certified, signed for at the Shotgun House on a gray morning. The return address was a firm in Lafayette larger than Yvette's. Inside was a petition filed in the 15th Judicial District. Brett Hargrove, plaintiff, the marsh by description, and the minerals beneath it. His lawyers had built the best story they could from poor material. They claimed the mineral estate had been community property, built and held during the marriage, and that the partition and the divorce had been made under a mutual error, both parties believing the marsh worthless. On that theory, they asked the court to undo the conveyance, or short of that, to declare Brett owner of half the minerals and half the royalties, past and future. Delia drove the petition to Lafayette and laid it on Yvette's desk. Yvette read it twice and set it down with the flat patience of someone who had seen the move before. On these facts, it's weak. Your mother left you the marsh by will. Property you inherit is your separate property under Louisiana law, not community, no matter that you were married when she died. The minerals prescribed back to the surface, so they're separate too, and the judgment that gave you this land is final. Rescinding a consent judgment for error is a steep hill, and error doesn't help a man who simply didn't bother to check what he was signing away. They have to know that. They do. Yvette folded her hands. This isn't about winning. They want to make defending it cost you more than the fight is worth. Run up your fees, eat your time, and hope you hand him a slice just to make it stop. The fruits of separate property angle is the fig leaf. It buys them a hearing. It won't buy them your minerals. It did cost her. Through the back half of that summer and into the fall, Brett's firm filed motion on motion, sent demand for documents, noticed her deposition twice, and moved it once. Delia spent her days answering lawyers instead of finishing the lease, hours at Yvette's conference table that she paid for out of the unclaimed royalty money she had just gotten back, the field's own money going straight to defending the field. The worst of it landed when Curtis Lemoyne called. Bayou Verde's own attorneys had seen the suit on the public record. They would not close the lease over a clouded title. Until Brett's claim was gone, the bonus and the royalty stayed exactly where they had always been, out of reach, just under the marsh. Brett had not taken the oil. He had simply stood between her and it, the way he had stood between her and a great deal for 38 years, and waited for her to tire. She did not tire the way he expected. Whitney called on a Sunday evening, the hour she used to reserve for checking in, back when she still did. Delia answered on the third ring and knew from the first syllable that her daughter was not calling as a daughter. "Dad's beside himself," Whitney said. "This lawsuit is bleeding everyone. His lawyers, your lawyer, all of it over a piece of swamp. Why can't you just sit down with him and work something out? Your father sued me, Whitney. I didn't go looking for him. He says the minerals came out of the marriage. He says you blindsided him." A pause, the sound of her moving to another room. "You've made your point. You found something out there. Fine. Give him half and let this go. For the family. There's no half to give. The land was your grandmother's. She left it to me and to no one through me. And I think she chose those words for exactly this." Delia kept her voice even. "Your father didn't blindside. He signed papers his own lawyer drew, and now he wants them back because they turn out to be worth something. You sound bitter. I sound certain. There's a difference, and I had to lose nearly everything to learn it." She let the quiet stretch. "Whitney, the family broke when your father moved the money and met Brooke and walked out. It broke again when you decided whose side paid better. I didn't do that. I'm only the one who stopped pretending it was fine." Whitney hung up without saying goodbye. Reed called 4 days later, and he was harder to read. He did not lead with Brett. He asked how she was, whether she was eating, whether the camp was safe to stay in alone. Then, near the end, carefully, he said his father had told him a version of things, and that he did not know what to believe anymore. "He says you went behind him," Reed said. "Whitney says you're being cruel. And then I think about you out there by yourself fighting lawyers, and none of it fits the mom I grew up with. What do you remember about your grandmother in that marsh?" He was quiet a moment. That she'd never sell it. That Dad called it the swamp, and she'd just pour him more coffee. She knew what she was protecting. "I'm finishing what she started. That's all this is." She did not push him. "You don't have to take a side tonight, Reed. Just don't let your sister or your father decide what's true for you." He said he would think about it. It was less than she wanted, and more than Whitney had given, and she held on to it. The thing that turned it was not the law. It was a phone call from a reporter. Camille Dorsey wrote for the Vermilion Current, the parish weekly out of Abbeville, and she was working a long piece on coastal land and who really owned the minerals under the marsh as the Gulf chewed the shoreline back. Dr. Osei had given her name to Camille as someone whose title work was worth a look. Camille drove down, expecting a few quotes about prescription and old severances. She got those. Over coffee at the camp, Delia explained the 1953 deed, the lapsed servitude, the deep sand under the eastern tract, all of it plainly, the way she would have explained a title to a client. Camille took it down. Then, asked why she was behind on the lease paperwork, Delia mentioned the lawsuit, and the story changed shape in front of her. Camille did her own digging after that. The divorce was public record. So was the marina, Hargrove Marine, with Brett's name on the slip leases and his face in the Chamber of Commerce photos. So was the petition in the 15th Judicial District, with its claim that a swamp both sides had called worthless was suddenly community property worth fighting for. Camille interviewed Dr. Osei on the geology and Yvette on the law, and Yvette, choosing her words, said the suit had no real footing and looked built to wear an older woman down. The article ran on a Wednesday, front of the local section, under a plain headline. He kept the house and the marina. He gave his wife the worthless marsh. Then he sued her for the oil under it. It was careful and it was documented, and it did not editorialize. It did not need to. It laid out a man who had taken the house on the bay and the business and the accounts, handed his wife of 38 years the one asset his lawyer called a courtesy, and gone to court to claw it back the moment it proved valuable. All while she did the work herself in a courthouse basement at 67. The piece named the ageism and the math and let readers do the rest. It traveled further than a parish weekly usually goes. A coastal news site picked it up, then a regional one. It moved around social media with comments about old men and younger wives and the women left holding the swamp. Slip holders at the marina saw it. So did the Chamber of Commerce. 11 days after it ran, Brett's lawyers filed to dismiss the suit without prejudice, the language they use when they are quitting without admitting they were wrong. He doesn't want this in front of a jury with his name in the paper, Yvette told her on the phone. Bad for the marina. Bad for him. He's done. Delia had won. The marsh stayed hers, surface and minerals both. She sat in the camp with the phone in her lap and felt mostly the tiredness of it. The months of motions and depositions and money spent defending what was already hers. The victory was real. It had also cost her a summer she would not get back. The dismissal cleared the title, and the title cleared the way. Yvette filed to confirm Delia's ownership against the old Houston severance. And with the servitude long prescribed, no one came forward to fight it. By December, the marsh was hers on the public record, surface and minerals beyond argument. Bayou Verde closed the lease the week before Christmas. Curtis Lemoyne brought the papers to Yvette's office, and Delia read every line the way she had promised, then signed where the tabs told her, the same loops she had used on a marriage license and a divorce decree, putting them now to something she had found herself. The bonus hit her account in January. The unclaimed royalties came back from estate. Cypress Bayou, once the title was clean, began paying the suspended share that had been accruing under the eastern tract for years. It did not make her rich the way Brett was rich. It made her free. The rented half of a shotgun house became a small place of her own near the marsh, raised on good pilings this time, with a porch that looked south toward the cane. She drilled a real water well. She kept Odette's old camp standing for what it was. She could have stopped there. A great many people told her to. Instead, she thought about the women like her, the ones who had signed what they were handed because a husband or a lawyer or a grown child told them it was fair. She had been one of them on a curb in Abbeville with a folder against her chest. The difference between her and the next woman was that Delia had once been taught to read the records, and most women never were. She called it held ground, after a term the oil men use for a lease that stays alive as long as the well keeps producing, and after the plainer thing the words meant. She ran the first session at a community center in Abbeville and expected 6 women. 19 came. There were 60 and 70 and a few past that, widowed or divorced, or simply tired of not understanding the papers in their own drawers. Delia taught them what a mineral severance was, how to read a deed, where the courthouse kept the books, how to tell whether the family land still carried the rights underneath it. Hollis came and explained how a layman thinks. Yvette drove down to walk them through what the law gave them and what it did not. Dr. Osei sent a graduate student with maps. Hollis kept coming after that, on workshop days and on others. He was easy company, and he treated her like the professional she had been before she was anyone's wife, and Delia found she liked having him around. She did not call it more than it was. At 67, she was done naming things before they had earned the name. The sessions became monthly, then drew a waiting list, then turned into a small program where a woman could spend a few weeks learning to run her own family's title from start to finish. One of the first attendees found a producing unit nobody had told her grandmother about and recovered 9 years of royalties. Another simply learned that the back 40 her late husband always called useless held the gravel rights to a working pit. The marsh that 3 men across 3 generations had called worthless was teaching other women to look under their own ground. Reed came in the spring, and he brought June. His daughter was 15, all elbows and quiet, and she had read Camille's article on her own and then read everything she could find about the case. She wanted to see the marsh. Reed stood on the new porch looking out at the cane while June peppered her grandmother with questions about servitudes and deep sand, and after a while he said, low, that he was sorry. He had let his father and his sister tell him a story, and he had stayed away because staying away was easier than choosing. You're choosing now, Delia said. It was enough. They started over from there, not back to what it had been, but into something with the truth in it. June spent 2 weeks of that summer at the camp, learning to read a conveyance index off the courthouse books, pulling a pirogue through the cuts the way Delia had as a girl. Winnie did not call. Some things stayed broken, and Delia let them. She had spent 38 years smoothing over what other people would not face, and she was finished with that work. Brett married Brooke that fall in a tent on the bay, by every account expensive and well-attended. June mentioned it because she felt she should. Delia listened and noticed that the old ache had simply gone, the way a tide goes out and does not announce it. He belonged to a life that no longer had any hold on her. On the first anniversary of the lease, held an open house at the community center. More than 70 women came, some who had recovered royalties and some who had only recovered the nerve to open their own files. Hollis gave a short talk on title work. A woman who had found her family's mineral rights stood up and could not finish for crying. Delia watched it from the back, the whole room of them, and felt the same steadiness she had felt in a courthouse basement with a record book open to a page no one had checked in years. She had walked out of a lawyer's office with a swamp and a check, written off by everyone who mattered to her. What she carried out had been worth more than the house and the marina together, and it had been hers the whole time. Waiting underground, her mother told her to run down proper. 67 was not the end of her account. It was the page where she finally read it for herself. This is Dreams Don't Age. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.